we all walk around in our cities, in our towns, and buildings just pop up seemingly out of nowhere, right? We see people working on them, but who initiates the building? And I think a lot of the issues that we talk about really relate to after a building is done or before the building is even there, but we rarely talk about how the building gets there. There seems to be this missing gap that disconnects the two sides of the conversation about who allows what to get built and the people that need what does get built.
All right, we're back. Most Modern, here with Minkoo Kang, Libo Lee. I'm Alex Ewan. We're done with season 2, and we've had a bunch of really interesting conversations about what people do in the built environment, how they built up their career as an architect, developer, contractor. And it really, I think, realized for us that there's a number of larger questions out there that we should probably answer. And I
What
think
kind of
the first
questions,
one,
Alex?
sorry?
What kind of questions, Alex?
Well, I think the first one is honestly, well, where do buildings come from? Up until a few years ago, I actually didn't really know, despite having worked in and studied architecture for quite a long time. So I think this first episode is really, just between us, is really trying to help our audience understand how do buildings get built? Why are they built? What are the mechanisms and the risks involved in building a building? So I think that we just start there. Guys, where do buildings come from?
I think that's an interesting question, right? Like we all walk around in our cities, in our towns, and buildings just pop up seemingly out of nowhere, right? We see people working on them, but who initiates the building? And I think a lot of the issues that we talk about really relate to after a building is done or before the building is even there, but we rarely talk about how the building gets there. There seems to be this missing gap that disconnects the two sides of the conversation about who allows what to get built and the people that need what does get built.
So it's like any product. We have an iPhone. We don't care how it gets built. We just want it to work. It's sort of like that with buildings, but a building, our home, our office, our school costs a lot more than any consumer product. So I do think it is important that we understand a little bit of the process.
So I guess we started from the end, right? The people that need the end product. But where does it begin? Kind of in manufacturing, there's a whole process that leads up to the product, the car, the iPhone getting shipped out the door. But where do buildings begin?
Well, I think we need to talk about who allows you to build a building because you can tinker, you can make anything in your shop, you can get a small product built, but buildings go through a larger regulatory process. And I think it really starts actually with the government. The government allows you to build a building. Now, why would the government want a building to be built or not want a building to be built?
Taxes.
Taxes, money, revenue. But there's also other things too. Let's say they need something to, they need a place they need to build a place essentially. So maybe it's about housing people, maybe it's
Hmm.
about creating an identity for a city.
But I guess before before governments came into play, right? People, I guess, were allowed to build things themselves. Like what separates where we are today, where the government, in a way, is the entity that says you're allowed or not allowed to build versus you just say going out in the middle of Wyoming and building whatever you want.
So Mickey, you deal a lot with the city. What's your perspective on what's the government's agenda when with regards to what gets built?
Well, you tell me. I don't know. Well, there are certain needs for a city to operate, right? I mean, in Boston's case, there's a huge shortage of housing. We need more housing, but because the government wants more housing, it's not getting built. We have to question why. And
Because the government wants more housing, it's not getting built. So you're saying there's a breakdown there?
yeah, because even though the government wants to have the housing built, it's not getting built as fast enough or as many units that they need because of a certain process that prohibits the speed or delays the speed.
So what can they do to enable building? I think of zoning. They say, we want housing here. We want offices there. We want commercial, industrial, institutional here. So I think one thing that we need to understand is that you can't just build whatever you want wherever, largely, except in Houston.
Yeah.
But that you have to fit within a larger plan that is concocted by an agency, a bureau, the Department of Planning, input from other stakeholders, um, and that there is a certain use that can be applied to different places within a city. And that's sort of whoever wants to build the building has to abide by and play by those rules.
But why doesn't the government just spend our tax dollars and build the buildings themselves? Like, why do they have to create the rules for another set of folks to then develop the building?
Oh,
Well, I think
that's a
certain governments
complicated
do.
question.
The ones with more socialist mindset do that. But I think it actually expands to the role of market in the building.
Mhm.
I think we have to understand that whoever wants to build needs to be incentivized to build. And the government, especially, let's say, in the North American context, especially in America, needs to create those economic incentives for someone to go in and do the work of doing the building. Because
Mhm.
it's not an easy process, it's a very complex process.
So I guess talking about incentives is interesting. Like going back to when we're talking about manufactured products, everyone to a certain extent doesn't need an iPhone, but everyone needs housing. So there is a pre-existing market out there. But why isn't, I guess, the supply of housing meeting the existing demand that we know is out there?
Don't get me started.
Well, there isn't enough of it. I think fundamentally everyone needs housing.
Mhm.
And so there's definitely a demand. And so the issue, basic economics, is a lack of supply.
Mhm.
And if we break it down, the reason why there's a lack of supply is probably because it's too hard to produce that supply. We can't outsource it to another country. We have to build it on site, and there's a whole bunch of regulations that guide it. But
Mhm.
I won't put it all on the government. That's for sure. There's a lot of factors that go into it.
Well, we know there's a lot of things that the governments are doing right now to incentivize housing. Like Alex, you mentioned, like rezoning, maybe creating subsidies and other things that make it easier for folks to build. So, as a developer, I guess the next person on the chain, someone who puts the project together, like what are the right market conditions for building something?
Yeah, the famous developer, the infamous developer.
Well, the market conditions thus far until a few years back was the low interest rates. They were incentivized to build because the money that they can lend was cheap enough to build and even go through the extensive process and still be able to make a living when it's done.
And I think when we talk about money in regard to buildings, we have to understand that this is a whole level of magnitude greater than any other product. The most expensive thing a person will buy in their life is probably their house. The second most expensive thing that they'll buy is probably their car. And their house could be 10 to 15 to 20 times more expensive than that car. So when you're dealing with 1% change in interest rates, that's a huge change in the overall budget of a project.
Yeah,
But
think
why
about the
does interest rates
size.
matter? Why doesn't the developer just come up with all the money themselves?
Hmm. I think that's a
Mm.
huge fallacy. That's a huge myth that the developer is this cash rich individual just hoarding money, waiting for it to be deployed to gentrify neighborhoods around the world. I don't think that's the case. Minkoo, you're a developer. How do you get money?
Well, money is fluid, right? Money finds a place to make more money. That's the rule. So when developers build, they first of all they don't want to put all their money in one project that you don't know when it will get the approvals, when it will be built for like at least 3 to 5 years. You can choose to put the same amount of money to the S&P 500 through stocks, and the
Bitcoin.
return will be much, much greater. Bitcoin, exactly. If you have put the same money, if I have put all the money in the projects in Bitcoin like last year, think about how much I'll be earning now. So,
So you're saying that really it's an investment decision to build a project.
yes, for some parts, it is an investment decision, and all money aren't the same. Some money comes from mission-driven backgrounds because they want to do some social good and make an impact. They choose projects to invest. Some money are just sharks that are looking for prey to build upon and to scale up. So there's a different type of money out there, and developers try to come up with a project and try to find sources where they can bring in the capital to enough to start assembling a team.
But I want to ask you a question about finding capital, but I think it's also important to point out that a developer doesn't need to be a huge multi-billion dollar company. A developer could be a single person who just wants to build a house somewhere. And so
Yeah, for sure.
And so this process applies to all scales of project too.
Yeah.
So I guess like as an investor who can invest in Bitcoin, why would I invest in buildings? Like why would I give my money to a developer to undertake this multi-year process?
Because you like buildings.
That is a reason. Some people are just fascinated by buildings. They want to put their money there.
Yeah, because you're fascinated about the process, about having a real thing out there. I mean, stock is traded online. I mean, they are paper stocks that you can get, but building is a real thing where people live, people do activities. And I think there is a fascination towards that. It's
But
also
buildings also,
seen,
they fulfill a need, right?
yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's whether it's housing, office, entertainment, they have a purpose and they have a use.
So maybe your returns will not be as great as if you're investing in the latest meme coin, but there's a more sustainable horizon for return because people will always they'll always need a roof over their head. They'll always need a place to work. They'll always need a place to watch a movie.
So I guess like maybe break it down for me. Like what are the basic economics of say like a rental building, right? Like how much like what's the money I put in? How do I measure what I get back and how do I do the math to make it so that this is a good investment?
Oh, where do we start? I think comparing to a condo model can be easier. So a condo, if it's a typical development, you buy the land, you build it, you sell it, and that's it. Rental, it's different, right? You buy the land, you build it, you rent it for a while, and you stabilize it, and then you decide whether you want to sell it or not. The big return comes from the sale of the asset, not the operation. The operation, because it depends on how much of a loan or an investment that you get, but it needs to be shared with all those people. And the big check comes from when you sell the building. But because the project of a rental, you have they are usually more dense, having more units in there. So the building value becomes a little higher. So you're not like selling bits and bits of the building, you're selling the building entirely. So I
But
guess
the rent
that's where the
cash flow that then pays off the debt.
Yes.
Versus a condo building, you have to essentially subsidize, you have to pay and finance the debt until you sell, and then you can pay it off entirely and then take whatever profit you have left over.
So I would say there's a little bit of more added complexity on the financing side, but it comes with a larger return at the end. Because
so as a developer, you're promising your investors a certain return, right? And then after you build the building and it either sells or it starts bringing cash flow, you have to return that promise. And there is a level of risk where the building that you built can't return on the promise that you originally promised, right?
Yes. So that's why you're seeing a lot of buildings, at the current market being sold here and there, like the permitted properties being sold here and there, because after a certain point with the interest rate hike and the construction costs increase, viable project gets no longer viable because of these market changes.
What is viable? What is the target return for most building projects?
It depends on the risk, actually. If the risk is higher, you have to promise a higher return. So it really depends on that. I can't nail down, and it also depends on the market.
So risk
Um,
could be what are those factors?
so, for example, if you're building in no man's land, the construction costs may be the same or even higher if there's no infrastructure, but you'll have a easier process. But once you build a place, you don't have a market who will be coming in to look at your place to buy it or rent it. If you build in a city, the process gets more complicated because you need to get all those approvals and then you need to build it. But because there are already a lot of people living in the city, there's a higher chance you're going to get the amount that you want. So that's the risk. That's the way that you review or evaluate the risk depending on the project. If I were putting so if building on the no man's land needs to work, that project needs to be hella good and promise a lot of return
Oh my
because
God.
I think that's not going to work. So unless you're like that's unless you're like I don't know, designed by someone who's very famous, has a brand, or like have some sort of
Mhm.
attraction that will bring people to there. So it's a fundamental question. Real estate needs to be operated. It needs to serve its purpose. It needs to be used by a lot of people to have value.
So it seems like there's a lot of factors that go into assessing the viability of a project.
Oh
Things
my.
that are partially in the owner's control, but also just pressures in the world, interest rates, acts of God, regulations that maybe one day will create a good project, but then the next day suddenly say that project's not going to quote unquote pencil out. That's not going to work.
For sure. But that's why it's fascinating.
No,
You get
indeed.
connected to all different worlds.
So we've been talking about the developer. We've been talking about the owner. Owner needs to get approval from the government. Government needs to say, okay, you can build a project here. Somebody comes in, an individual, a group says, okay, we want to build a project. So they start assessing the viability of the project. They start running the numbers. They start going through the approvals process. Who actually comes in and executes the project? The developer is not building the project. They're not designing it necessarily. They're more like the producer. So I think this is right where the architect comes in, the famous architect, as well as the general contractor, as well as the other consultants.
Wait. I thought architects do everything or supposed to do everything. So
Well,
what do
it's
you do,
interesting.
Alex?
No, it's interesting because I think you're there's this conception that the building starts with the architect, uh, and that the architect comes and executes a vision, and then the work is done. When in fact, the whole building process takes much longer. I'm working on projects that have been imagined to a certain extent. The zoning was created at that point 20 years ago, and we're only now getting to the architecture phase because it took a while for a developer to come in and then for them to hire the architect and to make it work. So, what is the architect's role in this?
Yeah, what do you do for a living, Alex?
All right, I'll answer my own question. The architect's role is really to envision what that building is going to look like in a more specific level than what the developer has already thought of. So the owner knows that they want a certain type of building. Say they want
Mhm.
a multifamily residential building. It's zoned for 4 stories tall. It can use a certain type of construction. It can have a certain amount of density. It requires this much parking. So the architect inherits a series of constraints that then they have to design the project around. Now, I think that I would break it down into two considerations, two sort of values that the designer will have. One is, can it fulfill all the requirements of the building? And that includes being on budget, um, meeting all the requirements, all the regulations, which include health and safety. Uh, and then the other is something that I think a lot of architects are more fascinated with, which is how can I create a new identity, a new aesthetic value out of this project? And for some people, those are the same. For others, they're extremely distinct. Now, I will just speak on the behalf of architects that we want beautiful spaces, we want beautiful buildings. But Minkoo, as the developer, do you care?
Of course. Of course I care. I mean, there may be developers who doesn't care, but I doubt it. I think every developer wants their space to be beautiful, wants their space to be unique and special, because that is also added value. But they don't know how to get there. And when talking to architects and when they show me a very creative idea, it's very easy to get discouraged and be scared because
Why
you
is
don't
that?
know how much that will cost.
So the,
Because I can tell you this. I mean, when developers typically approach architects is when the project is pretty much defined, right? Like meaning
Mhm.
you at least talked with the city and they like what you're doing. They will allow you to do what you want. You probably talked with the community members about a certain idea that you want to have some sort of building there. So they also like that idea. And then you talk to the investors, and they need to also support. And this needs to happen before going to the architect.
so before all of this happens, all this conversation is happening when no one knows what the building looks like.
Yes,
So what is the building at this point? Is it a
it's a
spreadsheet?
box.
Is it a Word document? Like how are people imagining what this thing is going to look like?
Well, I think there's a new generation of developers who actually largely come from the architecture background, where they have the skills to represent them. But still, a majority of developers, they just go there with a sketch or even just a memo or some sort of, idea of how many units that he thinks he can get. So yeah, I would say they live in a spreadsheet the majority of for the majority of the developers.
So it's essentially up until the architect shows up, the project, the building, is a financial equation
Yes.
that takes into a variety of values and considerations, but it doesn't exist as a 3D idea quite yet.
Yes. It exists. It may exist as a rudimentary box, and frankly, that's probably what you see that's getting built out there.
Well, that gives me a lot more hope that the architect is coming in and bringing a lot of value because I think that the building again is not it's not a financial product, it's not a stock, it's not a trust. It is a thing, and so we need to create the thinginess of this, to bring it to life essentially. So I think that's good. So I guess it would be helpful to then talk about the design process a little bit and what that
Mm.
entails. So the architect inherits some sort of series of metrics, some series of requirements. There's this building should be this high and it's going to be serve this purpose. So the architect then starts to think about, okay, based on my experience, my expertise, this is what I think it could be like. And I think there's a range of architects. There's ones that are more by the book, more traditional. They rely more on precedent and what has been built before. And probably some developers like that
Oh, not probably. I would say many or all.
because it's more predictable, right? It's there's
Yes.
less wrenches that can be thrown into the equation.
But why is that predictability important for developers? Like why would you hire an architect that is extremely predictable?
Because you made a lot of promises, right? You promised your bank or investor that you'll deliver a certain thing at a certain date at a certain price. You promised your city and the community a lot of benefit packages.
Mhm.
So some developers start working with contractors first, even before going to the architects, just to get that rough kind of numbers in place. But yeah, those promises are important because those are goals, and the architect, if they come up with a very funky idea, if it looks great, that's great, but they need to convince the developer that they can deliver on time and on schedule and on cost. If that
See, that
is
clarifies
hard
things for
to,
me.
yeah.
So I just want to say that clarifies things profoundly for me as the architect because I always thought the developer was just worried about their own bottom line and it was their money and if they made $2 million instead of $3 million they would be very upset. But now I realize that my boss, the developer, actually has a bunch of bosses of their own the investors, and that they are not,
Yes.
they're responsible to them.
But the bottom line probably occupies the majority of their worry. But
But
in order
that's
to get that bottom line, they need to fulfill all the promises. So it's a full package.
That's clear.
so I guess are the constraints being handed to the architect a version of those promises? Like is a developer translating a financial promise to their investors into a, I guess, building constraint promise that the architect must deliver to them?
Yes. So I think this is probably more relevant for commercial development. And there are, we have to acknowledge that there are all types of developers and developments out there, not necessarily commercial. So like people who are building museums, people who are building city halls, government facilities, people who are building institutions like higher education facilities, those are different. But for commercial developers, because they're not doing the work with their own money, they make a lot of promises. They come up with a deadline, and they usually hand in a quite specific breakdown of things to the architects, including the size of the building, the height of the building, which is defined by partly because of the code from the government, and also partly because of the financing. And then, the area, the number of units, the shape, those are all handed and defined and given to the architect for them, so that it starts with a certain specific expectation of a building.
No, that's clear. And I think as an architect, it's probably helpful to have those constraints because you can come up with a number of different responses, infinite responses to any given project, but you do need certain factors in the design process that limit a few of your decision-making processes so that you actually have something to design towards. Otherwise, we'd be constantly spinning our tires and coming up with new and interesting shapes without any purpose.
Yep, for sure. Creativity
Okay, so
comes from constraints.
I firmly believe that too. Okay, so once the project is quote unquote designed, what happens next? Do we just release it? Do we just say, all right, it's done?
No. Now the fun part begins. You have to present it to your community. And then you have to get feedback. And it's not, you shouldn't be taking that personally, right? I mean, even if you're designing, because the feedback can be very personal. And they are mostly non-architects. And some architects also are present in the community meetings, but the feedback can be very random.
But I thought like before the constraints get handed to the architect, all the parties have already agreed. Like, why are we redesigning the project?
Well, I think
yes, that's what drives me crazy, right?
well, what happens is that there's this other larger decision maker authority, and it's different based on places. So in a democratic society, we have this opportunity largely for people to give feedback, and I would say I work in San Francisco where you have something called discretionary review, which is pretty prominent, meaning anybody can give their discretion about a project, which the outcome of that is increases the risk because anybody can say, I don't like the way it looks. I don't like the way it stands in front of my building. I don't like the fact that it's purple. In other places, you have limitations on the discretion. So for instance, in New York, a lot of building is as of right. There are predefined regulations, styles, even just guidelines for what a building can or cannot look like. And if it fits within those guidelines, it will likely be passed. And so that creates a level of certainty, a level of stability that I think incentivizes building in a way that doesn't exist elsewhere. Now, if we go to other countries, this whole public review process just might not exist entirely. I'm not going to name them, but there are places where the government can just push through a project and say, no, we want it, it's going to happen. And sometimes this happens on a case-by-case basis, say for a big event or for an important project. But sometimes it's just how things operate. And in those places, you will see there is an incredible ability to get things done really quickly.
So this introduces, I guess, another level of risk for the developer, right? Like at this point, the architect, you have already hired the architect, you've already done an extensive amount of work, only to have this additional risk of the project you've worked on so far not being able to get built.
Yeah. So you
Sounds
get
like
all sorts of
Mike has
feedback,
gone through this.
all sorts of feedback, some related to design. I actually appreciate specific design related feedback that we can respond. But some
Mhm.
questions are about the fundamental idea of the project, which I thought we had an agreement on. So that's what drives, the process very unpredictable because people change their minds. Even government officials changes their mind. Um, and still, the building needs to move forward. So as a developer, if you're invested thus far, you want to have a building. So you make changes, and then that's why probably on the architect side, it's common to experience a project go and then stop and go again and stops again.
Mhm.
It's all because of these kind of processes, that the hurdles that you have to go through.
So is that a good thing? Should we be allowing people to say, well, judge the design of a project or to judge the foundation of the idea of the project in the first place?
I think so. I think it's a healthy discussion to have, but there's a certain limit, right? If it serves a public need, and I think this is where the city's role or the government's role can come in, which is there needs a mitigator. They need someone who takes comments from both sides and then
Mhm.
tries to mitigate and give us, a middle ground that can work on both ends. So in a strong government, like those processes are clear, so things speeds up. But in certain governments, if there isn't any clarity coming from the official end, then this becomes a continuous dialogue between the community and the developer. There's no decisions if the developer and only the community are the two parties who are negotiating. I don't think there is a healthy kind of middle ground. It's very difficult to make, but
So
of
it seems
course it
like
depends on the community.
communication, trust building, that's all really essential into getting a project done. You can't just
Yes,
ram the project.
Yeah, and all
but
this
some
happens before shovel hits the ground, so to speak, right?
yeah. When I started studying development, I was shocked by a professor telling me that when the construction starts, the risk gets lower.
Mhm.
Um, and when I was an architect, all I thought was, "Oh, how am I going to deal with this detail when it gets built? What if something happens during construction?" So it was the opposite. And now, like just us three talking about the processes for about a few minutes, it tells you my frustration and the complexity and the risk that's involved there.
So why does the risk suddenly drop when the construction starts?
I
Because
think it's
no
about
one,
the predictability.
yeah.
Mhm.
So no
So
one once it gets going, all the permits have been filed, the site permit, the building permit, it's good to go. As long as nothing happens on the construction site, the project will get built eventually.
yes, as long as nothing happens, because by the time you're, starting construction, all the agreements are there. Hopefully, no one will be stopping you from doing the work. But also, I recognize that there are issues that you will, find out perhaps in the ground or some sort of structural issues, ground issues, environmental issues that wasn't identified during the due diligence or the research phase. But those things can be managed. It will cost more, but you can do it. So those are considered predictable from the developer's end, hence lowers the risk.
So it's really getting agreement, coming to an accord about what the project's going to be like that is the riskiest, the most expensive, the most unpredictable aspect of getting a building built, and probably what makes it just so complicated.
Yes,
Is that why we don't have enough housing?
I think so. Well, when you go to other countries, there are too many housing now that's not occupied. Well, think what the difference there and here is during is in the process.
Yeah, China has millions of units that are unoccupied. They don't have a problem with reaching consensus. Everyone agrees, seems to agree there, and yet they've actually overbuilt, and so their market is in the complete opposite situation as Americans. There's too many units, there aren't enough buyers, whereas here we have too many buyers and not enough units.
Yes, I would prefer to be here.
So okay, so far we've covered who allows you to build, who gets the project started, and I guess who figures out what the project should look like. And suppose the community and everyone agrees that this project should get built. Who actually builds it? The architect is not going to personally put the shovel in the ground, right?
No, I don't get my hands dirty at all. I only sit down. No,
Have
it's
you
the
failed?
contractor. The general contractor shows up and gets the work done.
So each of these, I guess, participants make a promise to the person above them. Like, what's the contractor's promise to the architect and developer?
The contractor promises the delivery date and the cost. Well, if we go into detail, it depends on the contract type, but the developer usually wants the contract to promise the delivery date and the time with all the knowledge we have when we're starting the project.
And the contractor, I think it's important to note, has a relationship, a contractual relationship with the owner, but not with the architect. And
Yes.
the way that we, at least from the architecture side, we like things to be set up is we have a contractual relationship with the owner. Owner has a contractual relationship with the contractor, and we represent the owner's best interest in making sure that the contractor delivers the building to the specifications that we set forth. So there's this sort of triangle of checks and balances that is supposed to ensure that the building is done on time, on budget, and to the necessary quality.
We haven't mentioned also a very important part of the development or the construction project, which are the engineers.
Yeah,
Can you tell us a little more about engineers that you work with, Alex?
Yeah, so I don't know exactly how to put together a building. I think as an architect, you can think of yourself as more of the director of an orchestra. You don't necessarily need to know how to play the flute in order to make sure that the flute is integrated into the symphony. Same for all the other instruments. And so the architect is really trying to piece these things together. Now, it used to be where the architect, the master builder, was someone who did everything. But as buildings get more complex, as the requirements become more onerous, it is necessary to have expertise and consultants who can specialize in one aspect or another. So generally, you also are organizing a team of consultants during the design process, which includes engineers, so structural, mechanical, and electrical, plumbing, civil, as well as potentially other consultants, including permitting consultants, landscape consultants, lighting consultants, acoustical consultants, traffic consultants, community and neighborhood consultants, relocation consultants, sustainability consultants. The list goes on, and it keeps on growing. Obviously, if you're doing a smaller project, you have fewer of those. But for larger projects, you are really managing a huge team with their own contracts, their own fees, their own time requirements. And it takes a lot of work, to be honest.
Again, I thought architects were the one who are doing everything.
We pretend we are, but we're not. It's too much. It's too much to handle sometimes. And I think that's also what has transformed the profession of architecture, at least when it comes to delivering projects instead of just designing them. You have to spend a lot of time communicating and making sure things are clear and making sure things line up. Because our responsibility, and usually those consultants are under the architect, our responsibility is making sure that that all then feeds to the owner, who then gets their project on time, gets their investors paid out, the city gets what they want. So there's a lot of value that's locked up in making sure that that all comes together appropriately.
And there are also engineers hired by the owner, like the engineers who are related to the ground, like the geotechnical engineers, the civil engineers. Those are typically hired by the owners.
Yeah, and I would say that engineering is quite interesting because you want to work with an engineer that really gets what your motivation is. But engineers are usually looking to solve the problem at hand. They're not necessarily looking to expand the problem. And I think sometimes what gets architects caught up is when they think that, oh, this would be an interesting problem to deal with. And they try to come up with a creative solution versus the engineer who says, no, this is what we need to address and we're going to figure it out right now.
a creative solution sounds expensive.
I think that's what the owner would think too, and I definitely sympathize.
No, I learned these by experience. And I would never thought of this like creativity comes with a price tag. I never thought of it when I was still, working as a designer.
You
But I
don't.
guess is there situations where you can use creativity to make things cheaper? I guess like you think about
Yeah.
manufacturing, and there's a lot of
No.
creative ways that product designers and manufacturers design their product to save cost.
Yeah, that's my goal, right? Like but I think I'm trying to learn it by doing it. And yeah, it is definitely my goal because I believe that creativity is not necessarily results in adding cost. There are many ways of, again, like creativity comes from constraints, right? If we respect the constraints and try to find a way to resolve it creatively and also cost efficiently, I think that's the goal.
Yeah, and I think it's helpful for the designer also to understand that creativity has an inherent risk involved because generally you're coming up with something that hasn't been done before. And so that unknown, even if it might you know it's going to be surefire successful, that unknown is a factor because other people might think, "Oh, I'm averse to the unknown. I'm adverse to that sort of risk." Your lender, your owner, your contractor too. So
Hmm.
I think there is a sort of a little bit of strategy involved too, as to deploying creativity at the right time. You can't go in guns blazing all the time saying we're going to change the game all the time. We're going to do a totally new project, which sounds great. I would love to be able to do that, but it's just not feasible when so many people are involved. And so you have to be strategic as to when you say, okay, let's invest our time, our energy, our creativity in this aspect of the project, and make sure
Hmm.
that that really contributes to a successful outcome.
Yeah, I mean, like I said before, in commercial real estate, that will be the key. But I also think that if you're doing, although I'm not doing it myself, if you're doing museums, if you're doing institutional buildings, people will like to have a better quality at a cheaper cost. I mean, that's a given.
For sure.
So I think every owner or developer would appreciate that. And
It's not
again,
only a given right now, it's
yeah,
also an imperative because of issues about sustainability. And yeah.
Yeah. So what happens when they complete the project?
Well, you get a certificate of occupancy, which again is authorized by the state, essentially, usually the building department. And then you're allowed to use the building. And at that point, the developer decides, the owner gets control of the project, and they get to decide how they want to run and operate it.
So is the certificate of occupancy what defines project completeness? Like how do the rules around that work?
It's a bit fuzzy. You can get partial, basically partial completeness. So you might, for instance, say, let's say you're designing a restaurant and the
Hmm.
kitchen and the dining room are done, but the bar isn't. So you can still continue to work on the project and use particular, but be certified to use certain aspects of the project. Um, there's always things that need to be. Largely, what it means is that the project can, for the most part, run. So if you think about a car, the engine works, the lights turn on. Maybe the windshield wiper doesn't work completely, but for the most part, it's still operational and it can still drive.
So like what I guess who's responsible for project completeness?
it's usually the general contractor and the builder, and the architect also supports that because in order to get the project complete, the CO, engineers and the architects will need to submit an affidavit to basically certifying that all of the work was done correctly, all of the engineering needs were met. And
Hmm.
the city, after reviewing all that, after reviewing the building, after reviewing the details of inspecting the details of the building, they issue the certificate of occupancy.
So once I have the certificate of occupancy, the CO, my end customers can use the building, right? So I
Yes.
guess it is quite important to get that completeness. Would you say the completeness is the promise that everyone downstream from the developer is making? That's the end promise.
Well, the developer promises even further than that, right? Because now we need to really make the money. Now it's time to return all your debt and the financial services, right? Like
Mhm.
if it's a condo, you probably already started, even before getting the CO, already started marketing it and selling it so that whenever you get the CO, people can move in and then developers can cash out their investment, return all their debt, and call it a day. That's the ideal scenario.
So I guess in what situations do you not get the CO? After all this work is done, after the building is built, after your bar is half complete, the government
Oh,
comes in and says this building doesn't get a CO. Why does that happen?
Well, if the project is not to the standards, if it doesn't meet building code,
Mhm.
if there's major issues or flaws, if it's not safe to occupy, largely the government is concerned with public health and safety and making sure that the building is not going to fall down, that it's not going to become a liability, that it's not going to become a hazard. And of course, that's essential. And if the architect has drawn their construction drawings correctly and they've handed off to the contractor, it is the contractor's responsibility to make sure that the project is delivered to those standards. But it does happen, and it's not good.
it is a nightmare.
But for good reason, right? Like we all
So, yeah,
want buildings that we occupy to be safe and not a danger to our health.
yeah, and
Yeah, for
I
sure.
think we have to also realize that these are financial assets. Okay, so I don't want to sound like a grubby capitalist, but so the health and safety is important.
It's too
But
late.
the project is critical. There's this building in San Francisco, the Millennium Tower. It's 20 years old and it starts to sink. It sinks whatever an inch or two every year, and the tenants, well, actually the owners, it's a condo building. The condo association is suing the developer because that's not what
Mhm.
they were promised. So quality is critical at the end of the day. It is not something that can be rushed and it has to stand. And I think that's something that we also, if we go all the way back to the beginning of the process, that is what the concern of the government is to make sure that anything that is built is quality, it's good, it's not going to become a liability for the government. In fact, it's going to be an asset because it's going to cash flow, it's going to return taxes, it's going to house people, it's going to be a coffee shop or a library. I think it's really important to understand the connection between the end and the beginning of this whole process and
Mhm.
making sure that there's a level of stability and sustainability throughout the construction. I don't think, Minkoo, that's something that we necessarily think about that much when we're in it, when we're thick in the thick of it. But it is something that happens because these buildings last for a long time.
You know, when you were laying the first Lego block and think about, oh, I want to be an architect or whatever.
Yeah, it
I
was a
always
yellow
thought
one,
I
a yellow
always
one.
thought I always thought starting and finishing a building was going to be very easy, but look at me now.
What do you mean? It's before starting and after finishing. That's even more complicated.
Well, all of it. Like, when does the project start and finish? For me, I'm trying to, find that out by doing it. And the project starts with an idea, with a property, with a real property, and then the project ends after you return all your financial promises to your investors who helped you start it. And that is definitely a journey. I mean, it's minimum 3 to 5 years of your life. So the building that I'm doing needs to be goddamn good. Needs to be goddamn worth it. Because it's a lot of, sweat and tear and effort, and a lot of not only me, but like all the parties that were involved. At least like 20, 30 people working on even a very tiny, like 13,000 square feet building. So imagine the list goes longer and longer when the building gets larger.
So what happens though when you do complete that project? What is the sense that you get? Because it is tiring. It is you put a ton of energy into something like this.
Yeah, I'm yet to find out.
Well, I
Uh,
imagine it's a huge sense of accomplishment, and I think probably a sense of relief. And I think like any project, any large projects, the process is really important, and you're constantly striving towards that goal, whether it's financial, whether it's a value that you bring to the city to for your work. I do think that there's incentive beyond money to do these sorts of things, uh, but it's not easy. Easier said than done.
yeah. Well, the award is there. I think even though it's not completed yet, just looking at the building go up, that's a sensation. That's a really good feeling, like something that you worked on for 3-5 years, and it's something physical. People are going to live in it, and it will stay there, hopefully for like 30-50 years.
Yeah,
That's a
it
good
might
feeling.
outlive us. That's a weird thought, actually.
That's your legacy, right? That's something you're putting out in the real world that will be there and serve people's needs for a really long time.
Yeah, and that's the hope. And I think there's also, it's easy to get caught up in your own project, especially when you're working in a dense urban environment, though that contributes to a larger project, which is a city, a
Hmm.
place, somewhere that someone calls home, somewhere that someone loves, hopefully. And when you think about it that way, I think the context, all the things we discussed, all the little trials and tribulations, dealing with the residents, dealing with financing, dealing with things that come up on the job site, it all starts to make sense because it is a collective set of decisions that then contribute to a larger context.
Yeah, I don't
Yeah.
blame the community at all. I actually appreciate them because they have to deal with it even
Have to
after
deal
it's
with it, and
built.
that's I think that's what's important about buildings. Different from other art forms, it's extremely public,
Hmm.
meaning the person who pays for the building is not always the one who has to do with it the most. They're not the only user or the only consumer of the product. It is the people who occupy the building. They might work there, they might go to school there, they might be renting there, living there for a little bit. Also, the people who maintain it, uh, and also the neighborhood, the people who see it every day on their walk to school, or even visitors who come from abroad and pass by it. It is something that involves a lot of different people, and that's why I think the process becomes really complex because it has to appeal to a large group of constituents, much more than any form of art. If you think about books, film, television, it's completely different.
Yeah.
So as consumers of buildings ourselves, and maybe as consumers of buildings that are listening to this podcast, like as people who go through this long, complicated process in order to put this out in the world, what do you think can make us better consumers or more educated consumers of building products?
I wish more building enthusiasts can be present at the community meetings. Meaning, I wish the younger generation uh, can be more present and raise their have their voice heard from the city side, because I think it is at the moment quite imbalanced, because and it's hard, right? But I think we should try to be more engaged and more involved in the community where we live in, and try to have a say in what gets built and what doesn't.
Yeah, for me, I think people would benefit from understanding more. And this is what we're
Mhm.
trying to do here, is we're trying to lay out the table and show you this is what's at stake. This is how this sort of works. So that when you come with an opinion, it's an informed opinion, it's not a reaction. Um,
Mhm.
I think Minkoo, you and I, and Libo, you've also been involved with this sort of thing. We appreciate opinions, we appreciate perspectives, but when it's only a reaction from one standpoint of, oh, I don't like buildings, buildings are bad, but at the same time, we've all encountered the NIMBY, right? Not in my, I love housing, just not here. That's
Mhm.
not helpful anymore. And so I think it's also a natural reaction if you don't understand how things work. So education, even if you're not an architect or developer or a planner, is essential. And I think we have not done a good job as an industry of making that more transparent. So
Mhm.
whenever it's out there, I think trying to find out why something is a certain way, not getting mad at it, is always helpful.
So when people, I guess, tell us how to think, we can maybe reevaluate a little bit based on what we know on whether we should take up that opinion or maybe question it a little bit more.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we should all have opinions on buildings. We all live in them.
Mhm.
They're ubiquitous. They're essential. So it's important that more people play an active role in this sort of their inception.
Yeah. And be more open, I would say. I mean, if you don't like a building, I think the best thing to do is to live in it. because you don't have to see the building, but you're experiencing it, and you might find some good things about it that you didn't know. So just be open-minded.
Well, that's tough because I hate a lot of buildings I can't afford to live in. So
No, but I think that there's also a stigma around certain types of buildings, whether because of style or because of class. But I think we should all appreciate things for what they are. Some really nice buildings are really expensive, and that's a good thing. Some really nice buildings are also quite cheap and humble, and that's also a good thing. And so pursuing quality, I think, is important in everything that we do.
I mean, we can wrap on that comment. That was
Yeah.
a pretty good one.
I was gonna say, did we cover everything?
Well, I think we covered a lot of where buildings come from. Obviously, this is a large scale, kind of top 10,000 foot perspective of it.
Yeah.
And it's much more complicated and much more in the weeds. But I think I think I speak for all of us. We would like people to understand this. Even it was a shock to me when I realized when I was working on a project that, yeah, the developer isn't paying for this out of cash from their pocket. They're leveraging, they're going into debt. And also understanding how cities start to incentivize building or de-incentivize building as well.
And there's a lot more specific things that I think we're going to cover as we talk to more people, as we have more of these sessions, and it'll be interesting to dive into a lot more of the specifics for sure.
I think this has been an incredibly enlightening discussion. These are things that all of us, the three of us here, understand intuitively, but it's really helpful to actually clarify them and speak them out loud. I think having more discussions like this is really helpful, and we hope that our listeners took something away. If you have ideas for what makes a good building, maybe leave them in the comments or hit us up. But other than that, I think we're looking forward to further interviews with people involved with the built environment and the process of building or changing the world around us, but also these more informal discussions that we're having right now, where we kind of clarify some of the basics, some of the fundamentals that often go overlooked.
Yeah, and I guess if you have a question or something you're wondering about that you want us to talk about for an hour, please let us know.
Yeah, please follow, like, and subscribe.
Spotify and Apple Music, YouTube. Most part, and stay tuned.